Hi, in this video I will give you a quick practical overview of working with React. You will see state, JSX, and components being used inside a simple slideshow application. This is how that application can look like and behave. As you can see, I can navigate between different images based on the image ID. Now, one of the ways to get started quickly with React is by using an online editor, which I will be doing for now. I will be using codesandbox.io. Another possibility would be stackblitz.com. Both of them are based on Visual Studio Code. They have project templates for React and also for React with TypeScript. And they include automatic public hosting for demonstrations. This is what the start page of Code Sandbox looks like. And if I scroll down here, for example, I could find a React logo here for starting a React project, or I could explore some other options. And in this case, other options would include also React TypeScript, which we will be using later on in this course. I'm going to click on React for now to create a new React project. Inside our code sandbox, we will be creating an example slideshow component. We will see the component definition as a function, which is the common way nowadays to create components in React. We will see internal component state. In this case, just the image ID will be enough to represent all of the component state for us. And we will see JSX as a template language, as a mix of JavaScript and XML. You can follow along coding, or you can also see the finished solutions, which I will post in the description of this video. Here we can see what Code Sandbox has created for us as a template for a React project. In this case, there is one component called the app component, which in this case is a function that will just return some XML content. And I can change this XML content and, for example, write a new heading in here, which will then influence the rendering, the output on the right-hand side. In React, I can create components as JavaScript functions, and here I'm going to create a new component called Slideshow. And for now, I'm just going to pretend that this Slideshow component already exists in a different file. Here I'm importing from the relative path in the same directory, which means in order to create this slideshow component, I would have to create a new file inside the source folder. If I pretend that that file already exists, I could just already use my component. Of course, this will not work at the moment because the corresponding file does not exist so far. But I'm going to change that and start also creating a slideshow component, slideshow.js. And in this case, I'm going to capitalize the S at the beginning of slideshow. Components should always start with capital letters. A component itself in React would be written as a JavaScript function. It is defined as a function that returns an XML tree. And that function will actually be called every time the component needs to be rendered for the first time or re-rendered. I'm going to create a function called slideshow with a capital S. And that function will be used to define my component. I'm also going to export it. Oftentimes, components will be exported as the default from a module. And inside my slideshow component, I could return content that I would want to render in here. For now, I'm just going to include 3 dots. Then, as a next step, I could add some state to my component. Use state is a so-called hook that I can use to declare internal state for a component. And the hook itself is just a special JavaScript function which has a special meaning concerning React. The state hook will return an array that contains the current state and the corresponding setter. So what we see here will actually declare some internal state for the component, in this case containing the image ID, and I also have access to a corresponding setter for the image ID. And in here I'm going to reproduce this. I'm going to destructure an array in here. We're going to see later on in more detail what's going on in the background in JavaScript here. This will be the image or image ID, and I'm going to declare a corresponding setter. And I'm going to do all that based on the state hook, which I can include here via calling use state. I'm going to type this via autocompletion, which will also automatically import the use state function from the React module. And then I can call the use state function and give it an initial value. 0 will be the initial image that will be shown first. Based on the state of our component, we can then create so-called derived values. Usually we should make sure that a component holds the minimal state, so not having any redundant data in there. But other values, for example, the URL that will be used for the image, can be derived from state values. So if I know the image ID, I can create a URL based on that and based on a base URL. And that base URL I'm just going to take from this example code here. Pixum.photos is actually a service that provides some photos, in this case with resolution 300 by 200, and I can choose my own image ID by appending our corresponding value here. And based on that, I can create a derived value based on the state and on that external URL. I'm going to call it image URL, and that would just be the base URL plus the image, and I could convert it manually to a string as well. This is actually not really necessary. Once I have some values in here, for example, I have the image itself, the image ID, and the image URL, I can include those values somewhere in my JSX. For example, I'm going to create a heading, switching to JavaScript via the curly braces, and then including the image ID. And I can actually show the image. Again, here I can switch from XML to JavaScript via curly braces and include the image URL as the source parameter. I'm also going to include an alt text, for example, slideshow. So now this heading here and this image will always be shown based on the internal state. At the moment, I can change the state via initializing it differently from the source code. And something else I want to do in the future is actually have interactivity inside my application so the user can interact with the slideshow and change the value of the image. I can actually provide separate event handlers for that. For example, here I have a function called goToPreviousImage, which would do nothing if I'm already at 0, and otherwise it would go back by 1 step. And we can actually define this function inside our existing component function. So what I'm marking here is the component function, and inside that component function, before the return statement somewhere, I can actually define my own functions, for example, defining event handlers. So this one I'm going to call goToPrevImage. Here, if the user activates this function, for example, by clicking on a button, I would then call setImg to change the internal image value to something else. And that would of course depend on whether image is already 0, then nothing should happen, and otherwise I would set it to image -1. So this is one function that can be used to interact with this slideshow. So far it's not connected to any user interface, and I'm going to do that next. I'm going to add some buttons for the user to actually navigate through this slideshow. One of these buttons could be a next button. Another one could be, for example, for going back to the start. And then I'll add one to go to the previous image. For now, I've created some buttons that don't do anything so far. I can add some event handlers as JavaScript functions. As what we see here are JavaScript functions in the shape of some so-called arrow functions. The parameters would be on the left-hand side of the arrow, then there's an arrow, and then I can specify a function body or a return value. I'm going to connect this in here. For example, this button has an onClick handler, and inside that onClick handler, I'm actually going to write a JavaScript arrow function. The same I will do for the other two buttons. At the moment, those functions will for now remain empty, but I'm actually going to add some content in here right now. And here, in place of actually a function body with curly braces around it, I could also just write an expression here. For example, set img to 0. That would be the start button. Then we have a next button where I could, for example, do set img to img plus 1. And the previous button action is actually a little bit more complicated. This is why I have extracted that functionality here. I also see there's one curly brace missing here. And in here I can actually just write a function that calls goToPrevImage. Somewhere there seems to be a syntax error. Another curly brace missing here. this is the result, and I should actually have a working application here where I can go to the corresponding next image, the previous image, and also to the start image. In this small example, we've seen basics concerning state, JSX, and components. All these three topics will be covered in much more depth in later chapters.